Yuri, this is the 63rd day of this war in Ukraine, and I'm wondering if you would just give us a sense of what the situation is like there today. This is the 27th of April, 2022.
Indeed, it is the 63rd day of this war. And the last couple of days, we've been very inspired by the meeting but first by the visit to Kiev of the US State Secretary Antony Blinken and Secretary for Defense Mr. Lloyd Austin. And that visit was a great sign of reassurance. And this visit sent a signal across the international arena that Ukraine is not alone in this war. It sent a signal that Ukraine has true friends and partners who understand what we're going through and who will lend us a supportive shoulder and lend us, more importantly, heavy weaponry so that we can continue to fight this just war just on our side, and we can succeed in defeating the enemy, driving them out of our country and restoring peace. This was also followed the next day by the unprecedented historic event from our point of view, at which more than 40 ministers of defense of different countries, and this is like 30 NATO members plus another 10 countries who are not members of NATO alliance. They've all gathered at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, and they were preoccupied with only one thing. They were talking about how to help Ukraine defeat the Russian aggressor, the occupying forces. And this is really reassuring. The show of support that we had yesterday only proves that we will definitely win this war. And hopefully we've passed the turning point at which the help which we so badly need will begin to arrive faster and in larger quantities, because the sooner we get that help, the sooner we will be able to liberate more of Ukrainian cities, and the sooner we will be able to, restore peace in Ukraine, and which means restore peace in Europe, because Ukraine is, right in the center of Europe, and we are the eastern flank of NATO alliance. And this is something that is being realized more and more by our friends and partners in Europe. They understand, they begin to understand that what we have been saying for 2 months now is indeed the reality that we live in, that these risks are real. And look at what's happened in the last couple of days in the breakaway self-proclaimed Republic of Transnistria, which is part of Moldova.
That's precisely what I want to ask you about next. And I want to ask you a specific question. What is it about Transnistria that's happening right now? Well, better question. Who's behind what's happening in Transnistria? We've been hearing that there have been explosions and attacks there. Who's behind that? Is this something that the Russian military is engaged in, the FSB? Who's behind those developments in Transnistria?
While we still don't have conclusive evidence, and there is nowhere we can get it from, okay? We are not infiltrating our intelligence spies into other countries because we respect their sovereignty and we respect their integrity. At the same time, isn't not suspicious that as soon as it happened, almost immediately, Russia blamed these incidents on Ukraine. I mean, come on, you look at Ukraine. Ukraine is at the moment preoccupied with defending our own territory. Why on earth would we be interested in stirring some waters in our neighboring countries? In a country, mind you, Moldova is a country which is a great friend of Ukraine. The president of Moldova, she has been to Kiev a number of times, and we have great relationships with Moldova. So this is why, while we cannot officially point the finger of blame at Russia, we have officially stated that Ukraine is not behind this. We have nothing to do with this, and it's not logical. It's not like possible, and for this reason, everything will become known with time. We've seen this so many times in history. But for the moment, we understand that this is a provocation, which the only kind of probable goal of which is to stir more trouble and to probably alert the West even more that, you guys, as if you're dealing with us and we are serious about our intentions. We told you that we want to push even further. And this is why the West is beginning to realize that, some of these claims.
Let me jump in and ask this question then. One source told me that the Wagner Group has reportedly been seen in Transnistria, and there's supposedly some activity in Crimea, where Russian planes are prepared to move landing parties into Transnistria, into Moldova. What are you hearing about that?
Well, we know that Russia is very, very interested in gaining full control over the south of Ukraine. During the last week, we have seen that Russia has fired missiles even at Odessa, which is the southern Ukrainian city, and it's been relatively safe until recently. But during the last week, there have been missile strikes at Odessa. Now, Transnistria, of course, is very close to Odessa. And we understand that from the military point of view, it seems logical that Russia would want to perhaps use Transnistria as a platform from which to launch further offensive on Ukraine. So this could explain, the activities and these incidents. And I wouldn't want to speculate, but again, if you consider that Russia has really said it many times that they want to conquer the whole of the south of Ukraine, then what happens in Transnistria becomes a bit more logical and understandable. Under the pretext, because you've seen what happened. Yeah. When these incidents happened, Transnistria declared a high-level terrorist attack, and this sort of gives Russia a pretext to move in their forces into Transnistria to protect them from terrorism from Ukraine, but in reality, in future, to use this as a launching pad for further offensive against Ukraine.
So you haven't seen any concrete evidence that this is happening?
Well, we have seen evidence that Russia has already been using for some of their activities the region of Transnistria. So
we're talking about the Wagner Group here.
Well, I have no information about the Wagner Group, but and I wouldn't want to speculate. But this is something that Wagner Group does wherever they are sent. Syria, Ukraine. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're involved.
Okay. Then there's another development today, too, that's very important. There's been some activity in Western Russia, Belgorod and some other places where there have been explosions and essentially some kinds of attacks. And what we have heard from some folks in Ukraine is we don't know where this happened. We don't know where this came from. But some of the folks that I've spoken to who know about this say this looks like the work of Ukraine. So what can you share about this?
Well, we don't have any official confirmation from our general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces. And until we have anything from them, of course, we cannot comment. But at the same time, and this is how it was, for example, previously, it's not in our interest to comment on such incidents, because if you do, you disclose your tactics, and this can be used by the enemy at your disadvantage. So from this perspective, even even if there was information, it is the general staff is very, very confidential about their planning. There's only a very limited circle of people who are actually who have access to this information, and there are good reasons for that, right? It should be kept secret because it's a war, right? And our objective is to repel the enemy and defeat the enemy. So from this perspective, it's not it shouldn't be expected that our general staff will comment on their military tactics and strategy. But look, what has to be kept in mind as well is this. If you remember a couple of weeks, I think about a week and a half ago, there was a similar incident in Klimovo, which is also a village in Russian territory, and there was allegedly some strikes perpetrated airstrikes on this village, and Russia rushed to blame Ukraine. But then our security and intelligence services have intercepted certain phone calls in which Russian servicemen have been talking to each other, and they said that, look, we are doing this, they said, ourselves because we need to create a picture which will allow our command to carry out certain military activities. So we have to always, whenever something happens in Russia, we have to always remember that they are prepared to, and they have done this in the past, they're doing provocations, setting them up themselves and implementing them so that they can, in the future, use them as a pretext for mounting their offensives, for using more prohibited weapons and carrying out more war crimes.
Yeah,
that's how it is.
So yeah, I understand that, and most folks by now know that that's Russia's tactic. You know, these provocations. Plus, it's pretty obvious that whenever Russia does a provocation like that, usually some people are injured or some people are killed. But in this particular case, in the Belgorod incident, and earlier in this war, when there was some situations that Ukraine was suspected of being involved in it, there were no civilian casualties. There were just strikes on infrastructure. This is one of the things that makes people ask this question, if Ukraine is involved in this. And I understand where you're coming from the military point of view. You can't go into details on that, but thank you for that. But I just will say this, though. Your spokesperson for the president made some interesting comments today. Earlier, one of his advisors saying that karma is a cruel thing, and he talked about divine intervention, et cetera, et cetera. Those are really interesting comments against the backdrop of what you're telling me about this. And it makes everybody think, okay, yeah, Ukraine did this, but they're not going to say it. Is that right?
Well, like I said, I mean, I don't want to sound too secretive or whatever, but we want to be efficient, and for us, it is essential to keep it that way. You know, because otherwise, if we play with our cards open and laid on the table, the chances of victory, of a fast victory in the nearest future, will decrease. So, but hey, listen, there's another angle of looking at it, at this situation, and you know, I hope this is something that is beginning to happen, but we shouldn't dismiss the possibility of certain guerrilla war inside Russia, which is done by certain Russians themselves. You know, we've had reports here and we've had interceptions by our security services in which we've heard Russian servicemen say that, look, they say to each other, we want to boycott, we don't want to fight this war, right? So they boycott their own military activities by setting things on fire, by, we've had comic situations where a group of guys on Russian tanks, they rode around the same village in circles so that they've run out of fuel, so that they have an excuse to say, well, look, we cannot go any further because we've run out of fuel. You know, when these guys know the numbers in which they are dying, and you've seen the figures, it's 22,600, if I'm not mistaken, today. This is a lot of dead people. This is a lot of dead soldiers. And, 70% of those Russia even can't be bothered to take home and give them proper burial. So it is understandable that there probably is a part of Russian army and Russian military who are thinking to themselves, hey, look, we don't want to go to certain death. And, maybe this gives them some ideas as to, if we don't want to go there, let's make it so that we don't have to go there.
Very interesting point, Yurik Sak. As always, it's a pleasure to talk to you about everything, but not under these circumstances. There's no pleasure in talking about this war. It's just, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you because you're straight with us and you have continued to share with us the truth about the situation. Is there anything I haven't asked you about today that you think is important?
What I think is important, and we haven't mentioned it, and we, I think, need to at least briefly, is the situation with the visit of the UN Secretary General to Moscow and his visit to Ukraine as well. And when Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, when he was in Moscow yesterday, we all had an opportunity to once again see what kind of a liar is the leader of Russia, right? So he was sitting there next to the Secretary General of the United Nations, the organization who was set up in 1945 with the sole purpose, the preservation of international peace and security. And this guy, who actually is the leader of a country which has a permanent seat on the Security Council of the UN, and as a permanent member of the Security Council, they have the right of veto, which has become a right of genocide or right to commit genocide. So he's sitting next to the UN Secretary General and without blinking his eyes is telling him the same lies he's been telling to the whole world for the last 2 months. And this was a very uncomfortable scene to watch because, I was just wondering, how should Antonio Guterres feel when he knows that he's listening to lies? And it's disrespectful for him to just be there. But nevertheless, there is still hope that this visit will result in the possibility for us to establish evacuation corridors from Mariupol. Because in the last 24 hours, and this is the information that I heard about 3 hours ago, so I'm sure that the figure now is even higher. But the last time I checked, in the last 24 hours, Azovstal was bombed by anti-bunker bombs 35 times. So imagine, this is after the president of Russia said that he has given an order to stop the offensive of Azovstal. And there are still more than 1,000 civilians in Azovstal. There are hundreds of kids in Azovstal. There are 500 plus wounded Ukrainian soldiers in Azovstal who are bleeding to death because they cannot access any help. And this is another war crime. This is a violation of all possible crimes which are on the international humanitarian laws and conventions. So from this perspective, we are hopeful that the UN, which has failed, let's be frank, it has failed to preserve peace and security, the same way the League of Nations failed to preserve peace and security back in 1939. So we are faced with a situation where an impotent UN still gives us hope that it will be able to broker evacuation corridors and we will be able to save more human lives, more lives of civilian Ukrainians. So this is our hope for today, and I would like to believe that this will happen.
Yuri, thank you very much.
Thank you, JJ, and as always, pleasure. We'll speak soon.